Hi there. Welcome to Business Leadership Podcast. In this podcast, I interview successful business leaders and industry experts to help you grow your business. I truly believe that sometimes single insight can completely change your business directions and allow you to achieve your business goals. In this episode, my guest is owner at StoryStreetUSA. He's the author of 35 fictional and non-fictional books, most of them around communication. He has delivered talks at 20 federal government departments and agencies, 30 corporations and 235 school districts. His two recent books are Story Proof and Story Smart. He's the Stanford University's Distinguished Visiting Scholar. He was recruited by Department of State U.S. Speaker Program, and he has won multiple awards over the years. He is a winner of 2012 Leo Politi Golden Author Award by California Reader Associations. He's featured presented at multiple times at Aspen Idea Fest and a 3 times winner, 2009 Telly Gold Award, NASA Educational Program, and the list goes on. We had a discussion on many interesting topics around the communication on both psychology and the science of stories. I learned how stories are a critical part of any communication in a business environment. If you are business leaders and always trying to get better at building a relationship with the people, how to communicate effectively, and how to build a trust with your staff, you don't want to miss this discussion. This was one of those very in-depth discussion around communication in a business environment or non-business environment. I learned so much from the discussion, and I'm still trying to implement that in my daily life. So no further ado, please welcome my guest, Kendall Haven. Hi guys, welcome to Business Leadership Blog. Today my guest is Kendall Haven, is someone special in an area that I'm not very good at. Kendall, if you you publish, about 4 books so far, 4 or 5 books? How many books we've got?
Well, total is 34.
Wow.
There are 2 specifically that are on the topic for today, and that is the science of story.
Beautiful.
And then I've put out another dozen or so that have to do with how to apply story and teach story. But they were for educational audiences, and then the rest of them have been collections of mostly nonfiction stories that I've researched and written.
Wow. Okay. So the topic on a story, I think this is the area where a lot of business leader, not very expert at, and definitely I'm looking to your expertise. You're a master of telling stories. So I'm looking forward to our discussion, looking forward to learning from you. Thank you so much for time today.
Oh, it's a thrill. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, so if you walk us through, how do you help when it comes to building story or telling story? How do you help a business leaders or people when it comes to the area of building brands or discovering their own stories?
Discovering stories, the key, what we find, the key to effective stories, and we're not talking not so much about creating a story that's going to be entertaining, but one that achieves a stated purpose.
Okay.
Right? Effective storytelling has to be audience-centric, not teller-centric. Most business leaders that I work with who stumble at all wind up saying, they start out by saying, what do I want to say? What do I want to say? What's my message? Wrong question. The question is, what is it that I have to say in order to make my target audience hear actively in their conscious minds and memory what I need for them to hear? So the place to start is not with your message. It's with who's your audience.
But doesn't your audience changes over time? Like you could be speaking to one audience, then you have a different audience. So the audience changes. So what happened to the story?
The message doesn't change as you change audiences. Story is not the message. Think of story as your delivery vehicle. You want to picture the story as a car.
Okay.
The message is then the passengers in the car. Your job is not to deliver the car to its endpoint, it's to deliver the passengers. If you build a good car, that is to have braking system and propulsion system and steering system and suspension, blah blah blah, the car will do its job and get them there. If you don't put the components of the car together correctly, the passengers die in a fiery crash along the way because the car doesn't make it. So you start with your message and then say, where do I want that message to go? And where you want the message to go isn't out into the world. There's a lot of business magazines, I see articles all the time saying, tell your story, get your story out there. It's really bad advice. Why? Because you don't want to get your story out there. You want to get your messaging out there. And the story then is the vehicle that links your message to your target audience, which is the mind and memory of a specific group of people that you want to reach with this message.
Mm-hmm.
The story then has to be adjusted to different target audiences, the way you organize the information, the information that you either imply or specifically include, the vocabulary that you use, the assumptions you make about your target audience's background knowledge and topical knowledge. That all changes audience to audience, so you can deliver the same message to different audiences and they'll all get it the way you want them to.
Very interesting. So is that fair to say that generally people, they follow this strategy, what you just mentioned, that the message and the story is different? Do they develop multiple stories or many different stories around the same message of whatever audience comes across, they're going to deliver that in a different way?
Yes. You wind up with multiple, at least as a minimum, multiple versions of the same message. If I want to say something to, and I want to deliver the message to people in the board of directors, so I'm going up to the board of directors, I'm not going to deliver that same, if I want to get the same sense across to them, I wouldn't deliver the message the same way to them that I would say if I'm going to frontline workers.
Got you.
Right? But I could deliver the same message, but because they're different and their concerns are different, their issues are different, their focus is different, what's relevant to them is different, their experience and background information is different. I have to start with who the audience is and where the audience is and go to them, rather than say, here's my story, and you have to come to me, in a sense, to if you want to understand it. What we find is that focusing on just telling your story is the royal road to miscommunication.
And I've seen that happen very, very often. People, bring their own personal story they're trying to tell, and they're trying to relate back to the message afterwards. The message is not a core pillar, but they have a personal story, then they're trying to relate the message with the story.
You want a good example of that?
Sure.
I won't mention the company, but one of the insurance giants that I was working with, and I was working with 35 top management people in this, it's a tens of thousands of people across the world company. And there were some major structural changes that were going to come in. And the question was, these 35 people wanted to get consistency on the story that they would tell as they started to filter that change out through the various departments and levels. And I was going to do a one-day workshop on story structure with them. All 35 of them had seen at a conference the year before someone tell a story, and they said, it was a great business story. That's what we want our story to be like. And I said, well, let me look at the story. So I got a video of the presentation, and it was a cute story. It's about going to a McDonald's in the afternoon after the lunch crowd was over. This man, the teller of the story, into the McDonald's at the counter. One woman was handling the counter service, but she was busy. She was cleaning and cleaning up messes after the lunch rush and restocking the cups and the napkins. Not just lounging around. She was busy. And he stood there, and people started to come in, line up behind him, and the line grew longer and a little more tense. And she is busy and ignoring her current customers. And that's what the story is about. And it was a well-told story, and it's a really cute story. And they said, well, that's a great story. We want to do a story like that. And I asked all 35, and I said, okay, what was the point of the story?
Yeah.
And not one of the 35 got it right. To get to the point of the story, you had to keep listening to the video, or if you were there live, listening to the lecture, about another 35, 40 seconds. And you'd get to the point he was trying to make. And not one of them got it right when I asked them what was the point of the story. So of course, then that led to discussion. Well, gee, you guys didn't get the point of the story. Whose fault is that? And of course, it is the tellers.
Yeah.
He totally failed. He entertained, but he didn't get his message across because he didn't link the message into the story and use the story as a vehicle to deliver his message. He just used the story to entertain and then hoped that people would stay tuned to get the message.
Mm-hmm.
The whole key to effective storytelling is to link your message into the story and then deliver the story using the tenets of story and storytelling so that the story engages, holds attention, and accurately delivers your messaging into the conscious mind and memory of your target audience.
Mm-hmm. Is that one of the also mistake as well, trying to get the message out to the very end of the story instead of getting the message out very early, and then you can tell other stuff around it? Because from the McDonald's story, but you're saying that he got a message out in the last few seconds.
Well, not even in the last few seconds. It was 35 or 40 seconds after the story ended.
Wow. Okay.
The question and there aren't any hard and fast rules about where your messaging has to go. Better start by saying, all right, I know the message I wanted to. No, start by saying, what is the effect that I want to have on my target audience? And that's a behavioral shift, change in attitudes, beliefs, behavior, right? And then say, all right, what message do I have to deliver to them in order to drive that behavioral shift? Now you know the message that has to get to their conscious mind, and then say, I know that, and this is the research, and this is, everyone should know this, but most don't. What we find is that the content that reaches your sensory organs, eyes or ears, usually, is not the same as the content that first reaches your conscious mind. There is a whole lot of initial internal processing that happens to that message all around making it make sense to the individual, that happens at a subconscious level, that happens before the information gets to the conscious mind.
Yeah.
All right. Then that version that gets to the conscious mind is the one from which the mind says, what does this mean to me? And that is where influence starts to happen. That is to say, where you affect attitudes, beliefs, values, understanding in order to change behavior. So effective storytelling is a reverse engineering process. Start with the effect that you want, articulate that. It's amazing how many execs I've worked with that want to deliver a message and aren't quite sure what they want it to do. They just really got to deliver a message.
Yeah.
And say, all right, what is the actual message that you want to deliver to achieve that effect? And then say, how do I now build my story around that message so that the message comes clear and powerfully into the individual once they hear the story. And then if you start from that viewpoint and build the story from that reverse engineering viewpoint, however that you build the message into the story, it's going to work.
Very interesting. So let's talk about changing the behavior. So if the goal is to changing influence of behavior or changing a behavior on an audience, so you've done a lot of research in this area. So what is the key trigger? Is that emotion in a story? Is that a message in a story that influence more? Is that a tone in a story, or is it the flow in a story? So what are some of those key areas that influence more or less that your conscious mind influence the behavior?
Here's what we find. Start this way. There's a lot packed into that question. But start this way. When we started, and this was starting in 2010, when I first had access to EEG labs. And that would just say funding. So because the dollars start to roll up very quickly when you're going into a lab, where I could wire up audiences and watch their brains to see how they respond. One of the keys that we wanted to get is what triggers them. When we do an experiment, usually we'll bring in an audience, we'll feed them some information, do some evaluation, and then 3 months later, bring them back, wire them back up again, and have them tell us, if we told them a story, have them tell us the story that they heard. And we're looking for two things on that 3-month review. Do they actually get the story right? Did the story implant itself deeply enough in their memory so that they could recall it correctly? And when they recall and tell it, do they experience the same order of magnitude of emotional response that they did when they first heard it? And so that gives, if so, then we can say, well, that story is in their minds deeply enough so that it will have some real influence. It'll change it'll be recalled readily enough at an appropriate moment where it can start to affect behavior. All right. So what we found is that the essential gateway to influence is engagement. Someone has to be fully engaged. We can see that. We can see neural signatures for engagement in the EEG lab.
Mm-hmm.
They're not fully engaged. They're not going to be influenced. They're not going to be, their behavior is going to be changed. Their attitudes, beliefs aren't going to be changed. So when we look at what is engagement, we can now define engagement as emotionally laden attention. There is an essential emotional element, a component to
Mm-hmm.
engagement. You cannot engage an audience purely intellectually.
Mm-hmm.
You have to make it personal to them.
Okay.
You have to make it visceral to them. They have to feel the story. Well, that's where the elements of story come in. Story is a vehicle that lets you throw your audience into the midst of that event, whatever you're talking about, that situation,
Mm-hmm.
that place. Make them so that they can personally feel what it would be like to be there and create that emotional involvement. It doesn't, that is to say, there isn't one emotion that is more powerful and effective than another.
Mm-hmm.
It is the act of being emotionally involved. And then attention can be defined as focused mental energy over time. So we want to focus their mental energy on this thing that we're delivering, which engages them at an emotional level. And that then opens up the mind to accurately record the story and the information that goes with the story that we want to deliver. So yes, there is an essential emotional component to it.
I see.
No one ever, I mean, one fun way to say it is no one ever stormed Washington over a pie chart, right? They have to have some visceral, some emotional impact, and then action happens. Then reaction happens. So yes, there is an essential emotional component to it. But knowing that the elements of story, once we start talking about what are those elements of story, automatically tend to trigger that internal emotional involvement in the receiver. If you've identified who your target audience is and characterize that target audience, so you know something about their background, their attitudes, their prior knowledge, their concerns, their issues, and make the story relevant to them, it triggers that emotional involvement. So it's not a performance thing. It's a structural thing, which means you don't have to be a world-class speaker to deliver effective stories, even if you're doing it orally. And certainly not if you're doing it in writing. You don't have to be a world-class writer to write and create effective stories. The elements of story give you a guide for how to structure your material. You have your material.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you structure it? And that's where the elements of story that we're able to isolate and identify in the lab come into play. Because what we're talking about, the effective elements of story, what we're talking about is what are the informational bits and pieces that the human brain is hardwired to use to build up that initial make sense version of the material as it comes in through a sensory organ. So if you're listening to a lecture and the person says, he walked down the street, starts right there. Well, you don't know who he is. You don't know what's going on, but you start instantly to build an internal version of that. I mean, it's one of the experiments I've done where I give people the first sentence of a story, only the first sentence of a short story. And I'll say, okay, who's this story about? How's it going to end?
Yeah.
How do you want it to end?
So they discover
what's the point of the story? And they can, and 9 out of 10 people, even on the first sentence, even if none of that information is actually in there, can answer those questions because their mind automatically is hardwired to use structural elements of story to build up this sense and say, I know where this is going. Well, if you know that's what the mind's going to do, you know how to feed information into it. So it's not a question of writing ability or speaking ability. Any human being who is in any sort of a managerial position is sufficiently talented, both as a writer and a speaker, to be incredibly effective if they understand how to organize their material to achieve the effect that they want in their target audience.
Very interesting. So let's talk about, let me unpack a little bit about engagement. That is, I think, a lot of companies struggle, people struggle, especially with the digital media out there. Everybody's trying to get attention. And I think what it trained our brain is to have a very, very small attention span because we're scrolling the media all the time, right? So our attention span is very small and engagement is very small. So if I'm structuring my story, as you mentioned, is there studies done on emotions? What do I need to put in to get, are there some emotions better when you're getting engagement better? Like, fear is better than over anger, or are there some of those elements better to drive the engagement much faster in a structure of the
Mm,
story, or any thoughts on that?
yeah, let me unpack that a little bit. When we talk story, what we're looking for first is relevance. How does this relate to what I already know?
Mm-hmm.
How does this relate to what's important to me?
Yeah.
So that's a topical thing. Topical in that we're looking at what is the information in there?
Yeah.
What is the theme? What is the going to be? But those things that are important and relevant to you automatically trigger the emotions that you are dealing with as you deal with that topic. Okay.
Sure.
So that's one level of emotional involvement, which is very audience centric. Now,
Okay.
within the story element, what's most engaging is to look at character who has some kind of a goal,
Yeah.
something that they're after, which is relevant to the audience.
Mm-hmm.
For motives being the driving forces that make that goal important,
Mm-hmm.
motives that are relatable to the audience, and then bring in risk and danger.
Okay.
Okay. Goal and motive, character, goal, and motive creates
Okay.
suspense. Suspense
I
is the
see.
act of hanging up an audience between two things: a question you've made them care about
Okay.
and the answer to the question.
Okay.
So if the goal is important, the question is, will character achieve that? And what does that mean to me? What does that tell me? All right. So that's a curiosity thing. Excitement comes from facing risk and danger. There is, let me define those terms.
Okay.
Risk is the likelihood something's going to go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The mathematical probability of failure.
Okay.
All right. Danger is what happens to you if something goes wrong. It's the consequences of failure.
Sure.
Risk and danger always exist, and they are routinely underdeveloped and underused by corporate level communicators. A quick example. Yeah, I don't know how big of a room you're in, but let's say you're in a pretty good sized room, and I could take a 20-foot long 4x4, a hunk of wood,
Okay.
a post of wood, and lay it on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
If I said, I'll give you $50 if you dare to walk the entire length of that 4x4, would you do it? Yeah, I
Sure.
probably would too.
50,
Sure.
$50.
50
Yeah.
bucks, sure.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, there is some risk and there is some danger. You could
You can
trip,
fall.
fall,
You can
maybe twist an
fall.
ankle, bang your
Yeah.
head on something. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Also, you'd maybe get a little embarrassed, start to feel like a klutz, have your
Why are we doing it?
self-esteem go down the toilet, right?
Yeah. Why are we doing it? Yeah.
Why? But so there is some danger, but the risk is almost non-existent. It's 4 inches wide. It's on the floor. It's stable. You're not in a great rush. What we find is that mathematically, if we can measure and then multiply together risk times danger, that product tracks exactly with the neural signatures when we're in an EEG lab for excitement. Excitement is the greatest component of tension. And as the saying goes, as goes tension, so goes attention.
Yeah.
Excitement is your tool to control attention through a story, and it comes from risk and danger. Now, back to the plane. All right.
Okay.
Let's say I'm not going to lie it on the floor. I'm going to suspend it 1,000 feet up in the air. hang it over a craggy cliff, jagged rocks, shark-infested water. I'll wait for a hurricane to come up the coast so the wind's blowing 120 miles an hour up there. Then if I could find some idiot who would climb a ladder 1,000 feet up in the air and try to walk across that 4x4, I could fill a stadium full of people down below who would gladly pay $50 for the cheap seats to sit down below and watch to see if he's going to make it. The action hasn't changed. All that's changed is risk and danger. All right.
Very interesting.
Risk and danger control your engagement, your attention. And they are always present in every situation, and they're underutilized, and they create that internal tension, which triggers out, as depending on the individual, as several different emotions: fear, anxiety, but they create that internal tension that makes you want to drive toward a resolution of the story. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So those are the tools that we use to design the story. We'll add in one more level, so long as we're at it. What we find is that the impact the story has on you and your ability, your tendency, I won't say ability, your tendency to accurately be able to recall and relive that story 3 months later, rely heavily on the emotion that you feel just as the story ends. Call that, because we need to make a fancy name for all these things, residual resolution emotion. It's the emotion that sort of is a residual, hangs on in you just after the resolution of the story. All right. The factors that control that: 1, surprise. Was the ending surprising? That's manipulable and designable. 2, how satisfying was it? Now, what we find is that the two extremes, very satisfying, even more satisfying than I had expected, or grossly dissatisfying, as in outrageously unacceptable, are the keys to designing, to raising that residual resolution emotion. So satisfaction is a comparison of what I wanted to have happen to what actually happens. Surprise is a comparison of what I expected to have happen to what actually happens. So knowing that I want to increase, if I want the emotion that someone feels at the end, and it doesn't seem to matter, I'll leave off whether that needs to be positive or negative for a minute. Looking at those two elements and saying, I know I need to adjust, I need to control those two emotions at the end, surprise and satisfaction. Well, if I know that I want to achieve a certain level of surprise, that means I have to make my audience expect something different. If I know I want to achieve a certain level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction, then I want to adjust what I say and how I say it to make them desire to control what they are going to desire as they get to the end of the story. So when I say that all those that emotion, which is so incredibly powerful and impactful in deciding whether a story is going to exert influence or not, those are all controllable as design features in the story. And we all do it. Actually, we all do it automatically, subconsciously in our day-to-day stories. We just don't consciously think that we have control over those things. It's not hard to do. It doesn't take someone with a master's degree in writing. It doesn't take someone who's an expert in writing to do it. It just means you have to be aware of what you're trying to do consciously. So then, do you want that resolution emotion to be positive or negative? Here's what we find. If it's negative, you'll get it. That's what strongly negative emotions at the end are what prompt an immediate knee-jerk reaction. You want people to write letters. You want people to go out and protest on the street. You want to start a riot. That's what you want. Highly negative resolution emotion. But we find once people take that action, they write a letter, they go out on the street and hold a sign, they tend to go back to exactly the way they were and don't change attitudes, beliefs, values, or behavior long term. If you design that emotional at the end to be highly positive, that is, have the ending come out even better than they had expected, it does tend to set up long-term role model attitudes, so that long-term you do start to have a more demonstrable shift on attitudes and on behavior, but it won't show up immediately. It shows up over the course of months, not hours.
Mm-hmm. That almost explains the traffic on a social media, dislike or likes, you still get the traffic on it, depending on what you're trying to do. I think, and
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right that, intentionally it's a hard work to, structuring your story and planning the outcome I think is a hard work. You have to plan it and you have to work at it over the time.
Well, yes, it does take a little bit of work, but there are very concrete, specific tools that, if you know what you want that story to do, and what are your tools, like surprise, like satisfaction, that you're going to use to make the story do what you want it to do,
Yeah.
it is imminently doable. And that's really the takeaway message that comes out of all the story science research is this is not magic. This is not some alien gift given only to the few anointed ones who are called great speakers and great No, we all can do this. We all can do it. You just have to consciously be aware of exactly what works and what you have to do.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. So let's talk about businesses. Corporations need to build the stories. So how do they go about it, Kendall? Where do they get stuck from your experience? Where do you see that them getting stuck? And is there a one corporate story, or is there individual stories that has to match up to that? How it's a big puzzle how they need to sort out, because everybody need to connect with the story.
There are a number of corporate stories that a company really needs to have at the ready. A brand story, which is a story that defines how you want your audiences, your customers, to relate emotionally to the company. That's really a brand story.
Yeah.
There are origin stories that you really need to have. Where does this company come from? And that starts with, what are the values, what are the beliefs that the founding of the company was driven on. There's future vision story. Where are we going? What does it look like out there that's driving us? Journey story. Journey story is how you go from where you are to the future vision. So vision story and journey story are always linked together. Too many people try to mush them together into a single story. It's better to treat them separately because they have different purposes. The vision story is this always a positive ending. It's where you want to build positive surprise and satisfaction.
Yeah.
Right. And use it then to encourage it as goal and motive for the workers, say the people in the company, to do the journey. The journey is where all the work is. And what you need to do is make them see why they're doing the work. The journey is the work. And that's that future vision. So you need those stories. You need customer experience stories. Customer experience stories are how to really say, if you're a customer, what are your expectations when you walk in to our stores? What can you expect? And what could you desire? So what you're really setting up are those two things: the expectations and the desires, so that they form a story in their own minds about what their experience is going to be. And customer experience stories want to set that experience, that expectation, in a positive form. Those are sort of the minimal. There are other ones that you can add in, but if you can get those stories down so that the core messaging in each one of the stories supports the messaging in the other ones, but has the message, and then think of who are the key audiences for each of those stories. They don't all go to the same audiences, right? And how do I and then what do I know about those audiences and their needs, their expectations, their desires, their issues, their background, so that I can adjust the way I tell the story for that audience to deliver the message that goes with that particular story: origin story, the brand story, customer experience story, the journey stories, so forth. So it's like it's a matrix. You've got the kind of
Hmm.
stories, you've got your audiences, and then versions of the stories that fill in that matrix, so that you then are ready to present your material to any given audience at any given time, and know that they're highly likely to get the message that you want them to get in the way you want them to get it.
Very interesting. So how about the for last couple of years what we've gone through, the events takes place, do they modify your little bit story structure or messaging a little bit, like for example, COVID, where we just gone through, very important for business leader to tell story to scale their companies back again. A lot of companies are struggling with the labor shortages, right? So they
Yeah.
need to attract people to come work for them, right? So do they change messaging a little bit, or what do they change so they can attract more people and so they can scale the businesses?
What we're really talking about here are the general class of change stories.
Okay.
Change stories. Things change in businesses all the time. You're
Yeah.
changing policies. You're changing the marketplace because other competition comes in, it goes out. Demand change goes up and down. So policies change, benefits change, structure within the company change. There's change happening all the time. So the change story becomes a very routine part of company messaging, right?
Mm-hmm.
Almost every time I work with a company, I see them focusing on change and designing change messaging dead ass backwards.
Okay.
Uh, Change stories are not about change, period. They are not.
Okay.
They're about preservation. They're about what you preserve that's most important to your target audiences. And in order to preserve the things that are most important, you change other things that let the company survive and best maintain those attributes of working with the company, that attributes of the company that are most important.
Ah. Mm-hmm.
That's what a change story is about.
Ah.
Change, instead of being this grudging thing that we have to endure, that is to say, in story terms, the villain,
Mm-hmm.
the antagonist, change becomes the hero. Change suddenly becomes the way we preserve what's most important to us to preserve. So
Ah.
it completely flips people's attitude toward change. I'll
Mm-hmm.
give you a quick example if you want. This is a
Sure.
one of the major snack food companies
Okay.
in the world, headquartered, of course, in the US. They created a change office.
Okay.
It- I don't even want to go. I'm not even sure I know why they created a change office, but it was to manage, in theory, to manage the expectations of and the handling of change, either policy change, structural change, um, product mix change, any sort of a change within the company. So shortly after they were created, they created a video,
Yeah.
about a 5-minute video, 5-6 minute video about change. And what they wanted to do is show company workers, that is, the people on the production floors running the machines that make potato chips, and and drivers who lug bags of all these snack foods, things around the convenience stores and the grocery stores, and people in the sales office, and show them all, interview them all, and have them talk about change. And the message always was that they wanted to go for is, yeah, change is hard, change is tough. It was, but we always got through it, and we're better off afterwards for having gotten through it.
Okay.
And they put the message out. They put the video out. All frontline employees around the world got to see it. And it created the greatest mass exodus in the company history. People quit in droves because what they saw when they saw that video was, watch out, change is coming and it's going to be ugly.
Ah.
And either
Nobody probably expected that.
your job is going, or you're going to lose prestige, you're going to lose status because they're changing around so your job is going to be demoted, you're going to have more work to do. Uh, it,
Wow.
they asked me to come in and that's when I came in and look at the video and see if I could make some suggestions for, saving the situation. And I looked at, luckily they hadn't thrown any of the interviews away. So I was looking at the footage, speaking metaphorically, in the old days when there actually was film,
Mm-hmm.
that they left on the cutting room floor. while they had these guys talking about, yeah, we this change happened and it was hard but we got through it. What they left on the cutting room floor was these people blew my mind away, talking about how much they value working at this company, and the relationships that they had built up, and how much they look forward to going to work and seeing the people and doing their job, and the pride they had in their jobs. Left it out completely. Change stories aren't about the change, they're about preserving those things that were most important to their workers. And clearly what was most important to their workers were the relationships that they had at work, and the emotional attachment that they had to their jobs. So we flipped the video and had people talk about that, and say, and at the end say, we'll do anything we have to, we'll change whatever we have to change in order to maintain and preserve these.
Yeah, once you value those value, then it changes, becomes
so
easy.
you talk, it's such a simple change. Yeah. All the footage was there, they had it, they just looked at the purpose of a change story backwards, and so changed it, and it made a world of difference. Yeah, in the response of the frontline workers.
Yeah, I didn't even think of that when you were telling me the story, and I thought, they were on the right track. But when totally different way of looking at it, it works. But definitely when people buy into in the working there, and they value their relationships and everything, and change becomes very easy. It just becomes a very, very small item.
Well, and more importantly, change is something you use to preserve the things that are most important. So it becomes a positive, not a negative. It's not something that's small and we endure it. No, it seems something we look forward to doing, because we know that's the way we keep the things that are most important to us.
Wow, very, very interesting. Definitely business leaders that have so much time on their hand during this COVID time, they're working, I'm sure, they thinking through this, but, so if somebody wants to discover, figure out stories, like let's look at a little bit smaller corporation, the guy who, person who built the business, they build, they have a successful company. They didn't have a company story when they started a company. It was probably the personal story that became the company story when they started a business, because it was all about the person. How do they go about it? What is the journey they go on? Eventually this company scales up. Now they're 50, 100 employees. They gotta get into the company stories more than the personal story. So what is the journey they go on to discover those stories and figure out?
So that's when we start to expand beyond the origin story. Origin story is, this is the passion that drove the origin of this company, and the passion that then it should be infused into all of the aspects of the company. That's the origin is the origin of the energy and the passion that drives everything. But then you flip to, all right, now we're at a certain size, we need to look forward into a future vision. So the origin story, once the company starts to exist, I mean, and is stable, and then you go to the vision story. Where are we going, and what do we all want it to look like? And the idea of the vision story is to create a vision that every person in the story or in the company can identify with and adopt as their personal vision. So we have to look at the vision story in terms that are meaningful and relevant to everyone in the company, not just to the the CEO and the CFO, right? Who look at this is sales figures, this is we want to have this many stores and this many sales, and this level of profit. No, the vision story has to be much broader than that, so that it becomes relevant to and meaningful to every position, every person in the company, and then start to build the journey story, and let each group sort of build their own journey story, and combine those into the combined company journey story.
Mm-hmm.
Then start with the one other kind of story that I didn't mention before is the who are we story. Now that you start to get this is where people in the company get to talk about who they are, not background, but what it is that they do, what they perform, and how the world benefits from their work in the company and outside of the company. Another insurance company I was working with, again, one of the major ones that has insurance salesmen spread out all over
all over the place.
every community, if there's one on your block, it's one on the next block, right?
Yeah.
And they wanted to make all of those people start to feel like a part of a team. So they started. So what I had them do was start to create stories where they collected stories from those people about things they did in the community, things they didn't. Coach a little league team. I did, but tell the stories. I work with. Collect those stories and build it into a who are we story. And anyone could put in one of those stories. It was amazing how powerful that was for building up a sense of pride and community in all of those people.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked with the science writers, the female science writers at Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. There are like 500 of them out there, and built up this sort of this historical sense of, just as females who are now working in the sciences and working as writers, what are their experiences? What are their individual experiences? Built those into a series of stories so that they've now got a very active and incredibly enthusiastic and devoted pool of female science writers out there. It's just creating those who are we stories in various different kinds of structures. So you start to build some of that sense, to build a corporate sense of who are we? Who do we want to claim to the world that we are and that we will be? And once you've got those going, then you fall back on customer experience stories. By the time you get those sets of stories starting to roll, and the hardest part for most of those is creating mechanisms so that someone who's out in the field, a distant office somewhere, who experiences something or sees something, has a ready way not to just experience it themselves and maybe pass it on to a couple of friends, but get it back into the company stream of information. So what it requires is the creation of some formal mechanism for collecting those stories, and then screening them, organizing them. And so the creation of that sort of a mechanism does require a little effort, but I have never seen it not pay off 100-fold for the effort that was put in.
So how difficult this challenge, how difficult is this, Kendall, that, to preserve the company messaging and a structure of the story, when you have a lot of people out in a field and they're definitely collecting those stories or they're telling stories, do we need to preserve the message, first of all? And because now we're talking about personal stories, how about the structure of the story? Is it still has to change behaviors? How about those components we talk about it? It has to affect the change. So how difficult it is that to preserve that when people going out? Because there are so many people now we're talking about in a field.
Yeah, what has to be real clear and agreed on are, what are those core takeaway messages? An effective takeaway message really has three parts. There is some text, some wording. Generally speaking, that wording has to evoke some kind of a visual or sensory image. The reason for that is your brain has been evolutionarily wired to be incredibly good at picking up information from your five senses and storing it into memory, right? Because that's the way we gather information about the world. Text is incredibly new in a human evolutionarily standpoint, so we're not real good at remembering text. We don't remember words very accurately and very well. Sensory, but if there's text that's cued with some kind of an image, a sensory image, we'll remember it forever. And then the third component is we want that takeaway message to evoke some kind of an emotion. That we want, whatever the takeaway message is, we want that to create some kind of an emotion. So if you can think of text that is very visual, visual being the most common, but not automatically visual, could be auditory, could be a smell, that and an emotion that goes with that. that becomes then the anchor that everyone cues off of. Those sets of messaging takeaways, and then if a company, and this isn't limited to just big companies, because I've worked with some very small companies that have set up a story archive, where we have text, we have versions of the story, and some archival information, source of the story, where who wrote it, who told it, history of the story, where has it been used, what's the point, what's the takeaway message that goes with the story, some sense of it, so that people can take that story, and if it goes out into the field, of course, every person that tells it is going to adjust the wording a little bit. That's the way storytelling works. But if you've identified stories that work for for the company, that are part of the company available messaging, and the key takeaways from those stories, what happens is that nothing's going to work 100% of the time, but the vast majority of the time, the messaging that goes out into the world through all of those avenues and all of those fingers that the company can use winds up being incredibly positive in supporting the company's image and the company's version of the story that they want out into the world.
Very interesting. I mean, there's so many avenues business leaders, and so much work looks like that, when it comes to our business leaders, to get a handle on stories and train your people, to look for those things, right? So,
but here's the good news. Every human being, and I mean every human being, started at the age of about 1.5. As soon as you started to pick up a sense of language, started to work on their ability to tell stories, because it's how you got what you wanted. Okay? Every human being has spent most of their lifetime perfecting their ability to communicate in story structures. Here's the problem. It's not that you don't know it, it's that you don't know it consciously. Your conscious mind is the slowest processor in your brain. There are a number of other processors in your brain that are 1,000 times faster. So that things that you automatically work on that have to get handled over and over and over again, you tend to dump out of the conscious mind into these subconscious processors. I mean, if you had to breathe, and if you had your heart rate and you had to control it consciously, we'd all be dead, because we would have forgotten to make our heart beat, and we would have died long ago. Right? So you do it. So you tell your stories the same way. You dump that information into a subconscious processor. So when it's your experience and an audience that you're comfortable with, you're telling your own stories, you have this natural storytelling system that you've developed that you kick into. As soon as you're creating the story consciously, as soon as you're in a situation where you're a little bit uncomfortable and so focused on doing this presentation, you negate your ability to use that automatic natural system.
Yeah, that's so true.
It's not that you can't. I'll give you an example of, everyone can tie shoelaces, right? You know how to tie shoelaces. I'll guarantee you couldn't write down on a piece of paper right now in temporal sequential order what you do with each thumb and each finger when you tie your shoelaces.
I can't.
You do it, but you don't consciously know how you do it. You tell your stories the same way. Becoming an effective storyteller isn't about learning anything new, other than becoming consciously aware of a few tools that let you consciously become aware of what you have subconsciously spent your lifetime perfecting. You know how to do it. The whole idea of story science is to give you some tools that let you tap into that natural, automatic, highly effective system that you already know and use when you're just not thinking about it. You just do it.
Wow, very interesting. Yeah, no, I started this practice of, because, marketing was one of the area I wanted to get better at. So I said, listen, I got to tell my stories in many different ways. So when I started discovering stories, I noticed that, there's ups and downs everybody's life, right? You have a highs, you have a lows. So I discovered, I learned that I was collecting stories only on my highs, wherever accomplished, right? So I was very hesitant to go on a low and to get there, but that's where the good stories are. I take it, right? So but I was very hesitant. I don't know why, human nature, that we don't get into that stuff.
Every company does the same thing. You want to affect it. If you want to engage an audience and make them empathize with you, root for you and your success. Talk about the struggles. Almost the definition of struggles is watching a character that is of interest to us struggle to overcome problems and conflicts, facing great risk and danger in order to achieve a goal that is important to them and relevant to us. The greater the struggle, the greater the risk and danger that have to be faced, the more the audience automatically empathizes with the character. And we find when we test it in the lab, begin to automatically, without consciously thinking of it, adopt the attitudes and perspective of the character involved. So you get your
That's great
messaging
insight.
by talking about the struggle part of the story. You tend to get your messaging across just by having you and the company as characters struggle. The more they struggle, the more your audience will tend to automatically adopt the viewpoints and attitudes that you wanted them to adopt, just because we tend to empathize with characters who are nobly struggling for a goal.
Yeah, but emotionally, it's very uncomfortable to go visit that emotion again, what you just got over because you achieved something, right? So I think it feels uncomfortable when you
Failure stories aren't about failure. Failure stories are about the struggles to ultimately gain success. I mean, it's the old Edison story. You know, when someone said, gee, that's the 200th time you failed to invent a filament for a light bulb. Don't you feel like a failure? And he said, no, what I've done is prove very conclusively 200 ways that don't work. That means I'm that much closer to finding one that does. Yeah. Right? It's the same way with the change stories. It's flipping the story, called story reframing. Reframe the story so that you focus the story and the attention of your audience on that aspect that winds up delivering your message, whatever your message is. And the more there is struggle involved, the more appreciative and the more engaged your audience is going to be.
Wow, very interesting. I got to do some work on that. So let's talk about your journey, Kendall. How did you get so good at this? How did you decide that you want to focus your life's work in this area? So talk about your sad story.
Well, the short story.
Yeah.
We'll go back to 1982. By that time, I had my doctorate in oceanography, was working at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, leading a small team that we were looking at the environmental implications of advanced oceanic energy technologies for the Department of Energy. Okay, I was a science guy. My undergraduate was in general engineering, graduate school oceanography. I had never been in the Oregon State or University library half that had stories and literature in it. I only knew the science stacks, right? But I was also dating the woman who's now for 42 years been my partner, and was at the time wanting to get woo points. So she had a sister who was a single mom, had a kid who was started out 4 and then most of the time 5 during this period. And I would regularly take him, to the park to give his mom a break and get some woo points going here. And so we'd run around in the park and play on they had a big train in this particular park. We'd play on the train and we'd run and romp. And then I was supposed to every now and then calm him down, get him to sit for a little bit. And I found the only way I could get him to sit was to say, let's flop into the sandbox. I'll make up a story. But he'd sit quietly for him. I didn't think about the stories. I didn't care if it made sense. I didn't care if it went anywhere. If he was willing to sit and listen, I was in there for child management, not for storytelling, right?
Yeah.
Every time we start a story, a crowd would start to gather. First, it'd be other kids who were around by the sandbox. So we'd always flop into the sandbox. I don't know why we picked that, but we did. And then the parents or the guardians, whoever brought those kids to the park, would want to come over, and see what was going on to see if they should call the police, or they'd say, oh, no, I don't have to call. He's just telling the story. This is fine. And usually they'd stay to listen. And other adults would say, what's a crowd over by the sandbox? And they'd come over and say, people in business suits and, carrying briefcases, and would come over and set aside moments in their day and set aside their cares and their worries and their jammed up schedules to listen to a story that wasn't necessarily going anywhere.
Wow.
And even if it did, they wouldn't have known it because they missed the beginning of the story.
Yeah.
To sit and be engaged by a story. And one day in that park, this is one of those, you don't get very many real life epiphanies, one of those
Mm-hmm.
real flashes. One day it hit me that if I sat in that park and read any of the reports that I was paid very good money, I thought, by the
Mm-hmm.
Department of Energy to create, none of these people would stay and listen. There was something about story that held them there. And I realized that story, whatever that word meant, was an incredibly powerful tool to garner attention, engagement, and the minds of human beings. Far more so than were all the reports and all the data that we stuffed into the reports that I had to turn into Washington. Most of the time, people, the very people who paid us to do studies and ordered us to do the studies wouldn't read the reports
Yeah.
we'd send in. We'd send in 300-page reports and they'd say, well, yeah, tell me what it says. They just want the story.
Yeah.
And I pondered that over, the course of a couple of months and realized that this thing's story, whatever it was, had a unique ability to engage and control human minds that reports, that lectures, that data didn't hold. And so that's when I quit my job at the lab and said, now I'm going to be a full-time storyteller because I gotta find out what this is all about. And became the first person, actually, I think in the world, but certainly in the US, to become a full-time storyteller and join the national and the international storytelling associations with a background with a advanced degree in science. Most people get into storytelling through some form of art, right? And so instantly I became the science research guy to research questions like, why do we listen to stories? Why do we remember stories? And so that was 1982 when that happened. And so that's been now 40 years that I have that I've been leading that research effort. And by 2010, 2009, 2010 in there, we actually started to get some funding so that I didn't have to do all the studies with absolutely no funding. So we could actually start to do research in labs and bring in large numbers of test audiences and so that's when we started to work on the books and be able to put out some real information that was backed not just by our opinions and our observations, but was backed by some real solid research and some evidence-based findings.
So talk about your next book coming out. So what the
So
book is about? If you walk us through a little bit.
yeah, this is the third book. First book that came out. I want to look and see if other people have been researching it and went through 16 fields of science, evolutionary biology, psychology, you name it, and to look. Does anyone talk about this? And it's found out that everyone talks about story. They just don't use those that term. But what they're talking about, if they talk about human communication, is really what we're now calling story. And so that was the first book. Say, there's something here, and it's incredibly powerful. Second book was after I started to get funding to actually go into the lab and do research, and started to say, okay, here's what we're finding about the structural elements of story that control the way the human brain makes sense of and then creates meaning from incoming information.
Yeah.
That gives you those tools, those elements then are tools for you to use to structure your material, right? So, but in order to do any quantitative work on there, we had to interview the audience members before and after a story, and then convert the language that they would use to describe characters and events and the way they felt at the end into some standard psychological scales, so that we could go back and turn those into quantitative scores to be able to say create an impact or an influence potential number for a certain story. The question that left us with is, how does the brain do that? Every brain does it automatically as the story's going in. Well, if we knew more about how the brain does it, if we could model that, then we'd have much more explicit, definitive tools for people to use as they look at designing their own material. That's the third book. And it turns out that we can now say that every one of those elements of story that you care about, engagement, attention, trust, buy-in,
Mm-hmm.
empathy, influence. All of them are predictable, they are quantifiable, and they are controllable. And so that I'm now at a point where we've actually got the algorithms
Mm-hmm.
to set up to say, you want to take a certain audience, here's what you need to know about that audience. And then you can start to say, how do you want to present a certain theme or a certain topic? And we can start to score it. We can start to
Mm-hmm.
score it. You start to develop the story and we can score it. And we can say and make suggestions about, you want to change this score, you want to change that aspect of the way that people are going to receive it. Well, then here's the aspect of the story that you want to look at and maybe adjust. That's this book that we're now working on. So the first one was called Story Proof.
Mm-hmm.
Then no extra title.
Yeah.
Then the second was Story Smart. This
Yep.
is going to be the story effect revolution. What
Wow.
we're looking at is the story effect, the effect that stories have.
Well, marketer can really use that information and whatever they're trying to get to promote or whatever they want to get the story out. I think their group is always, well, everybody need to understand, but I think they probably if they can understand the consumer behavior, they can probably understand,
The,
take a lot more further.
yeah, the great news is that none of this is alien to everyone's mind. This isn't like learning calculus and astrophysics to be able to understand it. No, it's just a question of looking at what you already deep down know and thinking about your communications
Mm-hmm.
in a different way, using more explicit tools. It's like saying, you look at a brick wall and you say, wow, it's a great brick wall. I'm going to build a brick wall. Well, you don't build a brick wall at a time. You build it brick at a time.
Yeah.
And if you know about
Yeah.
bricks and cement, you can build any kind of wall you want.
Yeah.
So this is what we've been able to do by studying the human mind and the way the mind responds to different elements of incoming information.
Mm-hmm.
We've been able to say, okay, here are your bricks. Here's your bricks. Here's the cement. Go to town, do whatever you want. All you
Yeah.
have to do is just learn a little bit about a few of these different kind of bricks.
Yeah.
And that makes it makes story and the power, incredible power that goes with story. I mean, I've got examples of stories where I was asked to create a story to explain something in story form that was totally rejected. It was a Navy research group a few
Okay.
years ago. That's 2001 or two, I've forgotten which year.
Mm-hmm.
A group where for 1 year, senior Navy officers are assigned into this group. 10 to 12 senior Navy officers and about 15 to 18 junior Navy officers. They come together for a 1 year assignment, and the Chief of Naval Operations, 4-star admiral, gives them a research topic and says, you got 9 months, research this, and then
Mm-hmm.
report back to me. And they were supposed to, this is the first time that the Navy assigned that research group to say, what does cyberspace mean to the Navy?
Wow.
And they were 6 months, and every year I went and worked with this group because there's a new group every year, right? Because they're in trying to help them tell. I'd come in for like the last third of that 9-month period to help them shape the story they wanted to tell and figure out how they wanted to tell it. Because they, instead of doing a written report, they did all a series of oral briefings,
Mm-hmm.
group oral briefings. So I was in. They'd been 6 months in, and they were still arguing about what cyberspace was.
Wow.
And I said, guys, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. How can you make recommendations
Yeah.
and have the
Yeah.
whole thing ready to roll in 3 months if you don't even know what it is that you're going to make recommendations about?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I said, you got to have a definition. You got to have a clear definition of cyberspace ready to roll into this briefing that's going to make cyberspace clear and instantly understandable to the senior Navy brass. And they turned it back at me and said, well, okay, by tomorrow morning, you give us your recommendations for what that definition, the way we ought to describe cyberspace, what it ought to be. So they had 32 people total working on it for like 6 months. I
Mm-hmm.
would have 13 hours and just me to come up with my version of it. And I
Wow.
thought, okay, what do Navy people need? What do Navy people understand? They understand the ocean.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, we're going to make the analogy. Cyberspace is like a new sea that the Navy has to, investigate and dominate. I thought they'd like the dominate part because, they're Navy, they're strong.
Yeah, yeah.
And so what do you do when you go into a new sea? You want to understand the current, the boundaries, the hazards in it. What other vessels are on that sea? Which ones pose threats? Which ones don't? Well, the vessels that are on this cyberspace terminal, cyberspace are computer terminals.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you recognize the computer terminal? What are the boundaries of it? What are the currents? What are the activity in it look like? I had this whole analogy and story that I was going to delivered it to them. I was really pleased with it. I thought they're going to love this. Delivered it to them the next morning, and the one thing, and they all reacted exactly the same way. They all hated it. It turns out the one thing they had agreed upon was that they didn't, although they never told this to me, was they didn't want to liken cyberspace to a three-dimensional reality. They wanted to get across the sense that this wasn't like a three-dimensional reality. This was something different. Totally rejected the story, but yet for the next 2 days while I was still there, every conversation, I had 2 staff people also tracking this for me, going into different groups and different little teams. Every conversation started with my story and tried to break away from it. They totally rejected the story, but once they had heard it, it still dominated every conversation they had and every thought they had about how they were going to approach cyberspace.
Wow.
That's how powerful stories are. Can you imagine how dominant it would have been in their thinking if they hadn't totally rejected it out of hand?
Yeah.
Stories can be amazingly powerful in controlling the human mind.
Wow. Very powerful.
They are available to anyone who wants to understand how they work once they get inside the brain. Yeah. That's what the story science is all about.
Wow, very interesting, very powerful. So many insights that you share, Kendall, that, I'm still trying to keep a track of all the other points you made. That I got to go watch this whole interview again, and I got to make some points again. So,
yeah,
so much insight.
Then we'll get to schedule another talk and we
can
go at it again.
But hey, if all the business leaders are watching, I have definitely encouraged them to, hey, watch this and order your books, go through your books and reach out to you for conversation, so
I'm available. I do that with companies all the time.
So you reach out to you. Who knows where the conversation is going to take or what stories we're going to discover, and go tell your story, build your company, build your brand. It's grow.
I'll say, tell your message and use stories to tell your message.
Communicate.
It's your message that you want to get out there, and you want to use stories to do it. So story is the vehicle. It's not the message. It's the car. It's not it's not the passenger in the car that you want to really get to where you're going.
Beautiful, beautiful, very, very powerful. So where can people find you? Where can they connect with you? Where can they order your books, Kendall?
Easiest place is online, KendallHaven.com. I wanted to keep it simple, so just KendallHaven.com, and that's the easiest way to get a hold of me then, or and then email through that. It's easy. It's just Kendall@KendallHaven.com gets the email. Comes right here.
I'm going to include a link below the video as well. People can click a link. They can go to your website. I will say, drop a note, read your books, drop a note, connect with you, and who knows where the discussion can go.
Great.
Hey, I want to appreciate your time and all the insight you shared with me. It was really great discussion. I enjoyed it, learned so much from you. Thank you so much for time.
Oh, and thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
All right. Thank you so much, Ken.
Bye.